So, in my 30 plus year career, I have learned a ton of different languages. Some good, some bad. But I wanted to cover another language with my language series. This time, talking about a language that, whenever I started learning it back in 2015, I thought it was only going to be for one use, but it turned out to be actually quite an expansive language. Hi there, I'm Roy, and welcome to My Code Corner, where I take a hands-on approach to learning topics in computer science. And in today's episode, this is going to be the first lesson in the language series on Swift. If this is stuff you're interested in, definitely hit that subscribe button because I am going to be bouncing between languages as we're going to talk about now. So if you didn't or you haven't followed my C++, you can go back to my channel and you'll actually see I'm starting to put those together. But since I have got that language off the ground, I decided to go ahead and start with this new one. Of course, this being Swift. Now, these language series are not assuming that you know programming whatsoever. You may know another language. You may actually be taking my C++. And if you do, you're going to actually get an idea of what this one's going to, because I'm going to kind of follow along with the same pattern of teaching. But I'm making no assumptions that you've had any programming skills whatsoever. Again, I mentioned I already started with the C++. For this one, we're going to go ahead and work with Swift. And probably pretty soon, basically what I'm going to do is I'll do a few lessons of one language, a few lessons of C++ as I've already done. I think I've already got 5 or 6 episodes done. I'll go down the path with Swift a bit, then I'll jump over into Python. But if there's other languages that you might be interested in, definitely throw it in the comment section. Again, I've learned a ton of different languages, and I definitely would like to share at least as much as I can because why not? Might as well give back where I can. Now, why did I choose Swift? Well, as I mentioned before, whenever I picked up Swift in 2015, it really was because I was actually running an iOS development group. And, at the time, Apple was, if you did any sort of iOS development, either iPhone, iPad, or macOS, you actually would use Objective-C before Swift. But a problem with Objective-C is just like other types of C. It was written there in the early 80s, around the same time that C++ was had. But instead of that classes like what they did with C++, when they developed Objective-C, they decided to start taking some of the aspects of Smalltalk and putting it in. So it made it a little bit different. It was a kind of a messaging type C. Well, Apple used that for quite a while. And if you remember your history, around 1996, a person by the name of Steve Jobs, if you're an Apple type, everybody knows who Steve, actually you only have to be an Apple type not to know who Steve Jobs is. But when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he also brought Next computers with him. Next being that company that he founded after he was kind of ousted out of Apple. And Next actually had licensed Objective-C, and they kind of owned the rights to it. So whenever Jobs came back, one of the things in 96, they had the new version of macOS, and they decided to use Objective-C as its development language. Well, Objective-C was powerful, but I will say, especially for someone, because I actually developed in Objective-C too, because I actually wrote iOS apps before Swift came out. Objective-C was a bit, we'll say a little bit complicated, especially for somebody like me who actually comes from the C world. It didn't feel quite right. A lot of square brackets in Objective-C, trying to get used to how that worked. Objective-C also had a lot of those same dangerous parts like C does, things that tend to crash computers. Well, what Apple decided to do, they actually had someone, and they started working on it around 2010. He developed this new computer language that was called Swift. Now, Swift wasn't brought in until it was announced at WWDC in 2014, and really didn't hit Xcode until 2015. But after 2015, that was when all of us that was doing iOS development, we started looking down something a little bit different. Again, while Objective-C had its time, it also had its skeletons in its closet. So that's really what Apple was trying to do. They wanted to create something that was going to be a little bit more safe because, it's one thing to work on a computer, but when you're working with a mobile device, you want that language to be as safe as possible, especially because iOS itself is actually a secure operating system. Another reason why I like Swift, and coming from, I was originally a Unix programmer and then moved to Linux. Swift, much like Linux, is an open source system. True, Apple was the one that founded it. They're the ones that developed it. They're actually still the program leaders for it. But in 2015, they went ahead and made it open source. It does go under, I want to say, the Apache 2 license. But what's really neat about being open source is you can actually go on a GitHub, and I'll show you when we switch over to the computer, I'll show you where you can actually go. You can find the source code. And not only can you find the source code, if you find bugs, there's ways to actually submit the bugs to the developers themselves. Also, if let's say you had this great idea and you wanted to contribute to the Swift community, you can actually submit code that will actually get folded into future releases of Swift. It's really interesting to see how these open source communities expand things, because honestly, if it was just the developers themselves, the original group, there's so many ideas they probably would never come up with. And now that I think we are up to version 6.2.3 in Swift, tons of things have now folded into Swift. To include, as the next one says, it's not just for Apple. When Swift did come out, it was touted as this was going to be this was going to be the language that macOS and iOS, and of course then tvOS if you have an Apple TV, now the Vision OS for those that are doing the Vision Pros, but it was all the entire infrastructure. I forgot the watch even. It was everything that was in that Apple ecosystem. Well, since it is open source, people could actually take that code and they have begun to port it. There are currently ports for Linux and there's ports for Windows. There's other ones too. I think there's even some experimental things to actually write Swift to run on Android. But what's really interesting, the fact that it's on Linux specifically, means that people are using Swift to write servers. So again, this is not just a basic operating system that's a kind of a one-trick pony. It is becoming a full-fledged, real language, which is really cool. Again, nothing that we thought of whenever it first came out, but here we are. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to install and look at a little bit of, as I mentioned, the open source part of Swift. All right, the first thing I wanted to bring up is this one website. Gotta make sure to grab the right mouse since I'm now running on two different computers. This website here, the swift.org. This is the homepage for Swift, and I was correct. Matter of fact, you can always tell this install. Now I'm running this on a Mac, of course. That's why you can install it. If I was running it on my PC, the page will look a little bit different. You have to go somewhere a little different to install the Windows packages. But this is basically the homepage of the Swift community. So every documentation, all the community, where you'd submit bug reports, even where you'd point to get to the GitHubs is right here. So definitely, as you start learning Swift, this is going to be one of those websites that you want to kind of bookmark, because as things change, and they are changing. Again, it's been 10 years since Swift has come out, a little bit more than 10. And we're already up to major version 6. Now, these versions do change not quite every year, but lately they have been changing quite a bit as the macOS, iOS changes. But again, it's not necessarily because it's tied to the Apple platforms. It's just that because Apple being, of course, the project leaders, as they add things like liquid glass into iOS, they actually added not not directly in the main language itself, but a lot of the imports, the frameworks. And the frameworks are actually part of this too. And we'll cover things like frameworks as we continue down this path. We will actually cover, while I start with the language first, we will end up covering iOS and other those type of development environments. So because I know that developing your iPhone apps can be lucrative. I've made quite a few dollars on my own, but especially when it comes to signing and whatnot, that can get a little bit hairy. So definitely, again, subscribe, hang on. We will get through all of this, and we'll move on to install. Now, this being my Mac, now I already have Xcode installed, but every time they do a major release of iOS or macOS, you're going to get this new development tool. And on a Mac, and I'll tell you, it's for Swift and it's also for C and C++. The tool that's freely available is called Xcode. And so we're going to go ahead and open up the App Store. And for those that don't know how I can open this real quick, the command space will actually open up that prompt. But if you got your Mac, you probably recognize this. This being your App Store. One thing I will mention, just like when the C++ that I kind of focus it on Windows, because we're going to go into iOS development down the road, I'm going to focus on Mac for Swift. I have not developed Swift on PCs yet, simply because I haven't had a need to yet. Again, most of the Swift that I've developed is because of the mobile devices or tvOS. I've done a lot of that too. So I'm going to focus on the Mac. If we need to start exploring that, definitely put it in the comments if that's something that you're interested in, and I'll do some research on my own and then create those videos. But again, I haven't done it yet. Not that I can't, it's just I haven't had the need to yet. But when it comes to installing Xcode, of course, this is the home screen for the App Store. If you notice, there's this one section down here that says Develop. If I click Develop, you will see down here Xcode. And of course, Xcode, I'll go ahead and select this here, and I'll go ahead and open it up. This will tell you current version is it's 26.2. Actually, the funny thing about Xcode, it's going to actually follow the same number scheme as macOS. And honestly, now iOS, Apple this year decided to make all the numbers the same, which is kind of good because it's easier to figure out which one you're on. But it's 26.2 because that's the version of iOS that's out and macOS that's out. But to install it, it's super simple. Again, I've already got it installed, but all you have to do, instead of where it says open here, it will say get. Now you have to have an Apple account. I'm assuming you already do if you've got a Mac. But as soon as you click get, it will just install it, take the defaults. So again, I can't reinstall it. But I will show you what will happen once it's installed. Go ahead and pull up Xcode. I'll show you what it's going to look like, right, as I drag it from one screen to another, because it always opens it up on my primary screen. But when you start Xcode, this is what it's going to start up. You may, when you first install, it may ask you if you want to install simulators. macOS is installed by default. For the beginning of what we're going to do, macOS is perfectly fine. But if you want to go ahead and get a head start, I will show you there are components, and if you skip it later, this is going to be how you'll do it. You'll see these components. And of course, what do I have installed? Right now, I've only got macOS installed and iOS. if you don't have iOS or any of these that you want to run, it's as simple as clicking Get. I'm not going to install watchOS, tvOS, or visionOS because I'm not developing for those right now. Also notice that you have this predictive code completion model. I would say if it to ask if you want to install it, I would say yes. That might be the only thing. Of course, I have a lot of other versions of iOS that's installed because I've had this installed for quite a while. But the main thing I said is macOS and iOS are the primary simulators that you want. Again, macOS is built in, so you don't have to ask. iOS is the only one that's not. And of course, these are simulators. These are going to be, if you don't have devices, what you'll actually run, on, where, as you'll see when we start building iOS apps, I'm not going to necessarily have an iPad or an iPhone, or I might have, because I have a Pro Max and I have an iPad Pro. I have the big versions of it. But whenever I'm wanting to test, I'll test a lot of different versions. I'm not going to own every single one of them. So this piece here will actually let me choose sizes, orientations, let me do a lot of things. And that's why we actually install these simulators. But we don't, again, that's only for setup. But let's go ahead and start with our, as always, pulled it on the different screen on me whenever I pulled components up for whatever reason. Bring it back. Let's go ahead and do our must program that we always, when we start a new language, you're always going to build that first Hello World program. Now I'm going to show you. Again, this is right out of the box. This is what it's going to look like. So we're going to go ahead and create ourselves a new project. Now we're going to also create it as a macOS project. The reason I'm doing macOS rather than the others is simply because this is going to be as vanilla as you can get. We're going to just build on command line tools for now. The other things, again, will get a little bit more intense. We want to kind of stay away from the frameworks of other applications for now because they can confuse you, especially when you first start this one. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and click command line tool or double click it. And of course, looking here, one thing you want to make sure is that you've got Swift. Now you notice there's Objective-C. You can still build an Objective-C. That's perfectly fine. Usually that's more for if you need to maintain code or whatnot. I don't know many people that are actually building a new Objective-C. But of course, since this is in the heart of this is still just a C compiler minus the Swift. Even though Swift is a C-type language, just to let you know. But you can still build C and C++. So if you have a Mac and you start learning my C++ stuff, you can actually use Xcode to build your stuff for you. It is a good IDE. Of course, IDE standing for an integrated development environment, which is going to tie all the pieces for building together. But we'll go ahead and mark Swift. Organizational identifier. This one, you see, it looks like a reverse web address or URL. It really doesn't. This is more for when you build stuff. You can leave it to what it defaults to. Not a big deal. Same thing as team. You don't have to necessarily add an account for now if you're just building it in your own. But you do need a product name, and we are going to call this one Hello World. Of course, you can put spaces in product names. You just got to be careful what other characters you want to put, and it will tell you if it's not going to work. So we'll go ahead and hit next. It'll ask us where we want it to go, and of course, I've already got a couple tests as I'm playing around, making sure I've got my environment built right before I record. You also see this down here, this create Git repository on your Mac. When we will do a lesson on Git in the future, right now, unless it's something you really want to put into source control, that's basically a way to save the code and make changes and roll back. And it's a source code repository tool is what it is. don't worry about selecting that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hit create. It's going to create a new folder for me. I don't have to do a new folder here. I'll go ahead and hit create. And the first thing you're going to see, this is actually the setup of the project. For now, there's nothing here that you need to worry about. When we start talking about doing other operating systems, tvOS, watchOS, iOS, this is going to be where you'll make a lot of your changes. Again, it's beyond what we're going to talk about here, but realize is that it will put you on the screen, and you can go ahead and tab through these and see all the stuff that it talks about, but we're not going to worry about this because this is where, as I mentioned before, when you're building iOS apps and you need to get things signed and all that type of stuff before you can upload it to the store, this is the area that gets kind of, let's say, interesting. This is probably the part that every time I build a new iOS app, I have to go back and stumble through this because it's not super straightforward. And all the years I've been developing iOS for well over a decade now, this is the start. It's just never stuck in my brain. I always have to go do some Google searches. But I'll be here. We'll walk through it when we get to that point. But we'll get down to this, and you'll see this little bird here. Of course, what kind of bird is that? That's a Swift. It's a type of bird. That's really our source code file. And it built this little project scheme already for you. And the fun thing about Swift, or at least Xcode, is that when you create your program, your first thing it's going to do is build your Hello World program for you. We don't have to actually type anything. But what I wanted to do is go over what everything here means so that when we hit run, make sure this works, and we move on to our next lesson, at least we have a step forward what we're doing. So again, this is the IDE, and this is your editor. And of course, every color means something. Don't worry about it for now, but every color does mean a different thing, and you'll learn that because it makes it easy reading this code a lot easier. If you notice over here too is kind of this like a zoomed out map. I don't typically use this very much except to see that I've got a lot of code. In this case, there's not much code. What you see on the screen is all you've got. Now, we can do things like make this go away. We can also, depending on your screen real estate, we can even make your project structure here go away. That's what these buttons, this button here does. And of course, that's what this button here does. I'm going to leave that the way it is. Looking at the code, it's actually extremely straightforward. If you studied or took my C++, you notice how there was a lot of upfront code that we had to do. One of the nice things about Swift is that they made this very easy for beginners to learn. They wanted to make this, basically make the code as readable as possible. And when I mean readable, not from somebody who actually understands code, but from somebody who understands the flow of English. They actually, whenever they were developing this language, they actually use linguistics people, not linguistics from computers, but linguistics, true languages that people spoke and read and wrote. They use them to actually help them understand the flow better, so that when you look at the code, it kind of self-documents. And I know self-documenting code has always been a joke in computer science, but in Swift they really did. And as we start learning new frameworks and talking about why they look the way they are, realize that the original frameworks were from Next. So they were very, very difficult to understand what they may actually mean. There was a thing that was known as the Great Rewrite, is what I think, if I remember what it was called, where they took these old frameworks and simply rewrote them so that you could actually read the code just like reading a book. But we'll get into that in the future. But looking at this code, there's actually only 3 things that are here. First thing, if you see these // and if you're in my look at my C++ stuff, you'll realize // is the indicator of a comment. And so everything in here is commented. That's why it's all gray. Of course, it's going to pick up the name of the file, the name of the project, who wrote it, and when we wrote it. Not going to change anything here, but if you notice there's this little box here to the left. If I click this, that's known as folding. And it's a way you can actually, if you notice, a lot of the things in Xcode is to give you as much screen real estate as possible so you can work with. So rather than have, how many lines was that again? Of course, 2 ways to open that up. I can either click back where that little box is, or I can click on these 3 dots. Unfolds. So we had 6 lines here. And so I take these 6 lines, I fold them up, put them away. Don't care anymore. This is real good when you start writing a lot of functions and whatnot, and we'll talk about functions in the future. And of course, the line numbers were automatic. I didn't have to turn those on like I have to in Visual Studio. But the first line of real code is import foundation. This is the basis of the Swift language. So really, this is the thing. This is kind of like telling you, this is importing the entire library set for Swift. And you can actually, if you right click this, you can jump to the definition. Now, don't get scared what I'm about ready to do. So I'm going to click it. And you see it opens up a ton of code. Matter of fact, I mentioned that map before. If I select, all right, show my assistant. I'm going to actually drop this to the side a little bit. That's the other thing to get used to is what all you have. Close that. But you can see, remember I mentioned before that this is kind of a zoomed out version to see how much code there is. As I scroll through this, you can see there's a ton of code here. Matter of fact, there's a ton of imports here, which basically this is a kind of the library of libraries. Foundation is the basics. Of course, then you got a lot of code here that you won't be able to understand yet. We will. But one thing I do want to point out, the reason I wanted to show this is actually something that's kind of funny. If you look here, and you'll see a lot of these foundation dot and these things that start with NS. And this is actually one of those good things that you can quiz people that think they know iOS, that are Swift writers. Find out if they know what that NS means. It used to be you had a lot of NS's before they did that great rewrite. Well, I'm going to go ahead and clue you on a secret so you can actually, if you're talking to somebody who actually thinks they know everything about Swift and Apple development, this NS actually stands for Next Step, which was the operating system for Next computers. So this is actually a holdover when the Next Step operating system, which became Darwin, that's why you see Darwin, which is kind of a derivative of Unix. When Steve Jobs brought it over, all of the libraries had that Next Step in them because this is some of the original libraries from Next. So it's not the same code anymore, but the names did stay the same. Now let's go ahead and go back to our code, and the way to go back is just like a web page. That's what you'll find. Xcode's a lot like a web page. Hit that back button, you notice we're back to our code. Of course, the little map is gone. We don't really need it. But this import, that's what it does. It told that whole library, use everything. We're going to import that. And then we have that one. Of course, it's pretty straightforward. What do we know if we want to print hello world? Well, we just say print hello world. Of course, print being a function, and you'll find out that there's parameters of functions, and we will go into those. But all you do is you have this string, and that's what it's called when you put it between quotation marks like this. You're just going to print this string. Now, before I hit run, there is one thing I do want to point out. If you notice, if you're a C or C++ programmer, or actually programmer of a lot of different languages. I did mention that Swift is a C-like language. It actually derives from C, but also drove from a lot of other languages, Python, JavaScript. Uh, I've seen the list. There's probably like 8 or 9 different languages that have something in Swift. But one thing that they did not carry over from C and C++ is there is no semicolons. This line ends with this line. So you don't have to put, you can put a semicolon, it just won't do anything. So big difference when you see between C and C++ and Swift is C, C++, you're going to have a semicolon at the end of the line. In Swift, you don't. I can't tell you how many times I have made that mistake when I switch from language to language and you forget that. Again, you can put semicolons in Swift. It just doesn't work the other way around. And I've cleaned up a lot of syntax errors on that one. So let's go ahead and run this program, see what it does. And of course, run is simple as hitting this play button right here, or this build and run. And we click that, it's going to build. You'll see the build succeeded. And at the bottom, of course, this wasn't here before, but at the bottom, you'll see our output. There's our hello world, matches exactly what it said there. And then program ended with an exit code of 0. Notice I didn't put anything to mention what the exit code is. That's just default. So that's it. That's your first hello world program. And not counting the comments, because comments don't really count as what's known as SLOC or source lines of code. This is really 2 lines. So much easier than when we did the C++. And if you haven't seen it, I do highly suggest it's on my channel. I have a C++ playlist. Go check it out, at least the first few, just as we compare and contrast languages. And of course, we'll do the same thing once I do Python. So let's go ahead and jump back and close this one out. So, quick summary of what we talked about. So we did talk that this is the intro to my next language, being Swift. C++ has already started. Python is coming soon, probably in a few videos. We'll see. Basically, whenever the mood strikes me. I mentioned, why did we use Swift? Swift started as a replacement to Objective-C. Objective-C having some very dangerous parts to it that could cause devices to crash. So it tried to clean that up and also create a language that was easy and fun for programmers to develop in. And while it started that way, they did open source it. You can go to swift.org and see where we are. But people have already started porting it to different operating systems. Linux is there, Windows is there, Android's there. They've ported it to older versions of macOS. It's actually crazy what you can do if just basically give people the source code and some time. Showed you how to set up. Of course, setup for Xcode is extremely simple. It's as easy as installing any app on a Mac. It's the one reason why I like developing on Macs is simply because just why I like Macs in general is that it kind of takes a lot of that messiness that Windows can get into away from you. And setting up Xcode is no different. I used to tell a lot of people, if given a choice between a PC and a Mac, what would be the best device to be a developer for? I would always say Mac, because you can build a lot of things on Mac that you can run on Windows, but you can't necessarily build things on Windows that will run on a Mac. For example, iOS. Well, not 100% true. There's Xamarin now, but I digress. And then we wrote our first program, or at least we let the Xcode write our first program. It's only 2 lines, so I'm not gonna knock it for that. But it was as simple as importing the foundations, which is the basis of Swift, to all the frameworks. And you saw all the frameworks I pulled up, and basically to print a line, you simply say print and you put what you want to print. So simple. But that's it. That's the beginnings of Swift. We've got a long ways to go. I'm probably going to catch up to my C++ and we'll keep them in lockstep here shortly. And with that being said, we're going to follow the same pattern I did with C++, which was the next session. We're going to start talking of types and variables. Of course, like C++, we'll probably go across a few videos for that one because we can get a little bit long-winded on those. And they are a little bit different. So I definitely want to try to stress the similarities, the differences between the two. But I hope you enjoyed at least your first step in Swift. If you've never done this one before, this is actually a fun language to develop in. It almost feels like you're doing it in easy mode until you start getting into the deep bowels of things, and then it can get a little bit hairy. But we will, in the future, again, we're going to start with the basic language, and then we'll move into iOS development. Of course, iOS development would also include macOS, tvOS, and maybe a step or two into visionOS. I haven't played with that one yet. But you definitely want to come join by hitting that subscribe button. Also hitting the notify bell. I'm going to put these out as quick as I can. I have yet to come up with a good schedule. Some of these do take me a little bit longer to put together. It's actually surprising how long it takes to put some of these videos between the planning, the shooting, and the editing. It surprises me how long one of these does take to do. But definitely hit that subscribe button, hit the notify bell, and hit that thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. It helps drive viewers to the channel. And also, if there's other people you know that wants to learn some of these languages or learn computer science, just things. Again, I've got a bachelor's and master's in computer science. I've done this for over 30 years. I definitely want to start giving back and giving you some of the experience that I've learned over my time. But I appreciate coming on this journey. And until next time, I know.